Jung identified something in his clinical practice that modern psychology still refuses to acknowledge. A specific psychological type that appears in less than 1% of the population. These individuals don't just think differently. They perceive reality at a level that makes ordinary social existence almost impossible. In 1921, Jung published Psychological Types after decades of clinical observation. Hidden within this work was his discovery of what he called the introverted intuitive type. But what Jung documented about these individuals reads less like psychology and more like a warning. They see patterns others miss. They sense what people hide. They know things before they happen. And this gift systematically destroys their lives until they learn to integrate it consciously. Today I'll reveal Jung's 7 signs of this rare psychological type, why society attacks them for their perception, and the integration process that transforms this dangerous gift into extraordinary wisdom. Sign 1. You experience knowing without evidence. Jung wrote extensively about intuition as a legitimate psychological function, but he discovered that certain individuals possess what he called primary intuition. Their dominant way of processing reality operates through the unconscious rather than through sensory data. You've experienced this. You meet someone and immediately sense something wrong beneath their friendly exterior. 3 months later, everyone discovers what you already knew. You walk into a business meeting and feel the decision has already been made before anyone speaks. You're right. This isn't mystical. Jung understood it as rapid unconscious pattern recognition operating faster than conscious thought. Your brain processes micro-expressions, tonal shifts, environmental cues, and historical patterns simultaneously. The conclusion arrives in consciousness as knowing rather than reasoning. But here's what makes this sign dangerous. When you share these perceptions, people demand evidence. How do you know? What proof do you have? You have none. You just know. And this makes you seem irrational, paranoid, or arrogant to those who require visible evidence for every conclusion. Jung observed that individuals with this trait learn to stay silent about their perceptions. They've been wrong enough times when young and undeveloped that they doubt themselves. But they've been right far more often. The problem isn't their perception. The problem is that consensus reality operates on different rules than their psyche. Sign 2. You feel emotions that don't belong to you. Jung documented a phenomenon he called participation mystique. Certain individuals have psychological boundaries so permeable that they absorb the emotional states of their environment without conscious awareness. You've walked into rooms feeling fine and left feeling depressed. Except it wasn't your depression. You've spent time with anxious people and carried their anxiety for days. You felt the grief of strangers on public transportation without exchanging a word. Jung understood this as evidence of what he termed an undifferentiated feeling function, operating in conjunction with dominant intuition. Your psyche doesn't clearly separate self from other at the emotional level. Most psychology calls this poor boundaries and tries to fix it. Jung recognized it as a feature of rare psychological architecture, not a bug. The problem isn't that you absorb emotions. The problem is that you absorb them unconsciously without recognizing their source. This creates a specific pattern. You become exhausted in social situations, for reasons you can't explain. You need extensive solitude to recover. You're labeled antisocial or avoidant when actually you're processing the emotional residue of every interaction at depths others don't experience. Jung's patient from 1913 reported the same pattern. She couldn't hold employment because 8 hours surrounded by the unconscious emotions of co-workers left her psychologically devastated. It wasn't weakness. It was sensitivity operating without integration. Sign 3. You see through social performance instantly. Jung identified what he called the persona, the mask people construct for social acceptability. Most people interact with each other's personas and mistake them for authentic personality. You can't do this. When someone performs confidence while radiating insecurity, you see both simultaneously. When someone expresses support while harboring resentment, you feel the resentment beneath the words. When social groups maintain polite fiction about obvious problems, you perceive the fiction as clearly as the underlying truth. Jung wrote that this creates immediate social difficulty. Others sense that you see behind their masks. This makes them uncomfortable. They experience your perception as judgment even when you say nothing. You've noticed this. People become defensive around you without apparent cause. They accuse you of being negative when you've only observed reality. They claim you create problems when you've merely acknowledged problems that already exist. Jung called this shadow projection. When you reflect what people refuse to acknowledge about themselves, their unconscious has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Most people attack the mirror. This is why you've been scapegoated in groups throughout your life. Not because you cause problems, because you see problems that the collective has agreed to ignore. Your perception threatens the unconscious contracts that hold social groups together. Sign 4. You require meaning or you psychologically deteriorate. Jung discovered that certain psychological types cannot sustain themselves on external rewards alone. Achievement without meaning creates neurotic symptoms. Success without purpose generates depression. Social approval without authentic connection feels worse than isolation. You've experienced this. You've achieved goals that should have satisfied you and felt empty. You've received recognition that should have validated you and felt nothing. You've built relationships that looked right and felt hollow. Jung understood this as evidence of what he called the religious function of the psyche. Not religion in the institutional sense. The psychological need for connection to something larger than ego concerns. When you live against this need, your psyche rebels. Anxiety increases. Depression emerges. A sense of meaninglessness pervades everything despite external circumstances that should produce contentment. Most people can distract themselves from this emptiness through consumption, achievement, or social activity. You cannot. The emptiness follows you everywhere until you address it directly. Jung observed that individuals with this trait often appear non-functional by conventional standards during their developmental years. They can't commit to careers that lack meaning. They can't sustain relationships built on convenience. They can't pretend that shallow goals matter. Society labels this failure to launch or impracticality. Jung recognized it as the psyche refusing to waste its life on what doesn't matter. Sign 5. You've been called too much your entire life. Too sensitive. too intense, too complicated, too deep, too serious, too analytical, too emotional, too much. Jung identified a pattern in his rare psychological types. They consistently receive feedback throughout their lives that their fundamental nature is excessive. Too much for their families, too much for their friends, too much for their partners, too much for ordinary existence. This creates a specific wound. You learn to suppress your depth to make others comfortable. You learn to perform shallowness you don't feel. You learn to pretend things don't affect you when they penetrate to your core. You learn to apologize for your perception. Jung observed that this suppression creates tremendous psychological pressure. Your authentic self doesn't disappear when you hide it. It goes underground and builds pressure until it erupts in crisis, breakdown, or transformation. The tragedy Jung documented is that these rare individuals often spend decades believing something is fundamentally wrong with them. They internalize every criticism as evidence of defect, rather than recognizing that a world built for different psychological types will inevitably pathologize those who don't fit. Jung's crucial insight was that you're not too much. You're simply more than environments designed for less can accommodate. Sign 6. You experience time differently. Jung noticed that individuals with dominant introverted intuition have an unusual relationship with linear time. Their consciousness moves fluidly between past, present, and future in ways that others find disorienting. You've experienced this. You see how current patterns will unfold into future consequences, while others remain fixated on immediate circumstances. You recognize how present situations repeat historical dynamics that most people have forgotten. You sense the trajectory of relationships, organizations, and situations far before outcomes manifest. This creates a specific frustration. You try to warn people about where things are heading. They dismiss your concerns as pessimism or anxiety. Then, events unfold exactly as you perceived, and everyone acts surprised. But you knew. You always knew. Jung understood this as intuition operating across temporal dimensions, rather than remaining fixed in present-moment sensory experience. Your consciousness naturally synthesizes patterns across time, while most people process only what's immediately visible. This also explains why you may struggle with conventional productivity. Your psyche isn't designed for repetitive present-moment tasks. It's designed for pattern recognition across temporal spans. Forcing it into linear, time-bound work creates psychological strain that others don't experience. Sign 7. You sense a purpose you can't yet articulate. Jung identified what he called the transcendent function, a psychological drive toward wholeness and meaning that operates beneath conscious awareness. In rare psychological types, this drive is unusually strong. You feel this, a persistent sense that you're meant for something beyond ordinary existence. Not fame or recognition necessarily. Something more fundamental. A contribution you're supposed to make. A truth you're supposed to embody. A transformation you're supposed to facilitate. But here's what makes this sign particularly difficult. The purpose remains unclear. You feel its presence without seeing its shape. You sense its importance without understanding its content. You know you're meant for something without knowing what that something is. Jung observed that this creates significant suffering during developmental years. You can't commit fully to paths that don't align with this unnamed purpose. But you can't articulate what would align because the purpose hasn't revealed itself yet. This isn't confusion. Jung recognized it as evidence of unlived potential pressing toward expression. The discomfort isn't pathology. It's your psyche refusing to let you settle for less than what you're capable of becoming. Now that you recognize these signs, you need to understand why Jung considered this psychological type both gifted and dangerous. The gift is obvious. You perceive what others miss. You sense what others suppress. You know what others haven't yet discovered. This perception is genuinely valuable when developed and integrated consciously. The danger is equally real. Without integration, these traits destroy you from the inside out. Jung documented 3 specific ways this destruction manifests. Danger 1. Isolation becomes identity. Because social interaction exhausts you and most people can't match your depth. You begin withdrawing. At first, the solitude feels like relief. Eventually, it becomes a prison you've built yourself. Jung observed that rare psychological types often justify their isolation as spiritual superiority. Everyone else is too unconscious to bother with. This is shadow inflation masquerading as wisdom. True integration requires engagement with the world, not escape from it. Danger 2. Perception without boundaries creates psychological flooding. You absorb everything. Everyone's emotions. Every room's tension. Every relationship's unspoken dynamics. Without conscious boundaries. This creates chronic overwhelm that mimics anxiety disorders, depression, and even psychotic symptoms. Jung's patient nearly lost herself entirely because she couldn't distinguish her psychological contents from what she absorbed from others. This isn't rare among individuals with these traits. It's almost universal until integration occurs. Danger 3. Meaning addiction replaces meaning pursuit. Because you require meaning so intensely, you become vulnerable to false sources that provide meaning feelings without substance. Cults specifically target individuals with your psychological profile. Conspiracy theories appeal to your pattern recognition while leading you away from truth. Grandiose spiritual beliefs offer the transcendence you crave without the development you need. Jung understood that the hunger for meaning is valid, but it must be fed consciously or it will accept any nutrition, including poison. Here is what Jung discovered about integration. The same traits that create danger become extraordinary gifts when developed consciously. Phase 1. Recognition. The first task is simply recognizing what you are. Most rare psychological types spend decades believing they're defective versions of common types. You're not a broken sensor. You're an intact intuitive. You're not an emotionally dysregulated feeler. You're an undeveloped empath. This recognition changes everything. You stop trying to fix what was never broken. You start developing what was always present. Phase 2. Differentiation. Once you recognize your nature, you must learn to differentiate. What's yours versus what you've absorbed? What you actually perceive versus what you're projecting? What serves your development versus what merely feels meaningful? Jung's technique was simple but demanding. Solitude. Time alone without input allows absorbed material to dissipate. What remains is yours. What dissolves was never yours to begin with. You must also differentiate between intuition and anxiety. They feel similar but produce opposite results. Intuition arrives with clarity even when its content is disturbing. Anxiety arrives with confusion and generates only more anxiety. Learning to distinguish them requires practice and honest self-observation. Phase 3. Conscious engagement. Integration doesn't mean withdrawal. It means engaging with the world from an integrated position rather than an overwhelmed one. This requires what Jung called psychological containers. The ability to perceive without absorbing, to see shadows without becoming infected by them, to recognize patterns without needing to announce them, to hold your perception lightly rather than being held by it. Jung's patient achieved this after 3 years of integration work. She developed the ability to use her perception consciously. She became a counselor where her gifts served others. She built relationships with people who valued her depth rather than being threatened by it. The perception remained. The overwhelm transformed. You have the same potential. The traits that have created so much difficulty are the same traits that can create extraordinary contribution. Your perception isn't a malfunction. It's advanced psychological architecture that requires conscious development. Your absorption isn't weakness. It's sensitivity that requires conscious boundaries. Your need for meaning isn't impractical. It's wisdom that refuses to waste your life. Your sense of purpose isn't confusion. It's potential seeking expression. Jung believed that individuals with these traits serve an essential function in human psychological evolution. You see what collective consciousness isn't ready to acknowledge. You feel what others have learned to suppress. You know what hasn't yet become visible. This makes you uncomfortable to be around for those who prefer comfortable unconsciousness. But it makes you essential for those ready to grow. Your work isn't to become normal. Your work is to become integrated. When you integrate these traits consciously, you stop suffering from your perception and start serving with it. You stop being overwhelmed by emotions and start transmuting them. You stop seeking meaning desperately and start creating it deliberately. Jung's rare psychological type isn't a burden to overcome. It's a gift to develop. The question isn't whether you have these traits. If you've watched this far, you almost certainly do. The question is whether you'll develop them consciously or let them develop you unconsciously. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. For individuals like you, this privilege requires more courage than most people will ever need. It requires facing what others avoid, feeling what others suppress, knowing what others deny, but it also offers something most people never experience: the possibility of living from psychological truth rather than social fiction, the capacity for depth that shallow existence cannot provide, the potential to perceive and participate in consciousness, evolution itself. You're not too much for this world. You're exactly what certain moments in history require. Jung spent his career studying people like you because he understood something profound. The individuals who don't fit are often the individuals who push humanity forward. Your difficulty fitting in isn't a flaw to correct. It's a signal that you're operating on different parameters than those around you. Learn to integrate your perception. Develop your gifts consciously. Find the few who can match your depth and build your life with them. And remember what Jung discovered in Case After Case. The traits that seem like curses before integration become extraordinary capacities after integration. Your perception is not your problem. Your lack of integration is your problem. Solve that, and everything changes. If you recognized yourself in these 7 signs, you understand now why you've always felt different. You are different, not defective. Rare. If you're ready to stop pathologizing your depth and start developing it, continue exploring Jung's work on psychological types and individuation. The map exists. You simply need to follow it. Your perception is waiting to become wisdom. Your sensitivity is waiting to become strength. Your purpose is waiting to become clear. Integration is the path. Jung drew the map. Walking it is your work. If you want to understand the shadow side of these traits and how unconscious people drain those with differentiated perception, watch the video appearing now where I reveal Jung's warnings about the psychological vampires that target sensitive individuals. Subscribe because we're just beginning to explore what makes your psychological type both rare and essential. Your depth isn't a problem to solve. It's a gift to develop. See you in the next video.